which leads to this topic about the C state. And you think about jobs versus, I'm just going to call them the players if you think of sports. And there are 4 main variations that kind of matter in this discussion. So someone who has an A job, right? An A job is critical. And basically, if you're here, you're matched well, right? You have a very important job with a lot of responsibility done by someone who is performing at an A level. And then you have a match here. There are always jobs in organizations that are just less risk. In fact, in today's organization, I would say it's jobs with less thinking or independent decision-making abilities. It's more straightforward. It's a lot clearer what to do. And you have individuals who are in this state. And then when you have someone who has a C job but is performing at A levels, so this is usually where we promote, right? But the problem for us all comes right here. This is where there is more emotional toil as a leader when you have someone who has an important job, but they're in a C mindset. And how do you work with that? Now, I'm going to define a little further what I mean by, I totally ran out of whiteboard space. I've never done this one. So I'm going to call this a C state. And there are 5 traits that we came up with just since Wednesday. So I'm sure we can make it longer after this week. But one is outcome bias. If you haven't heard of outcome bias, you're so biased to the outcome, you almost don't care about process. The most extreme examples in sports is if I can break the opponent's kneecaps, we can win the game, right? Like, it doesn't matter how you do it, I need to get the outcome. So outcome bias tends to drive a tremendous amount of short-term benefits, terrible long-term consequences. The second is desperation. If you do anything when you feel desperation, I think whether it's hiring, promotions, it just leads to very bad things. Depleted, when you feel depleted. And I think when we think depleted, we think physical depletion, but emotional depletion is far worse. When you feel like your mind is just gone. Emotional tilt. So tilt is a word that we get from the game of poker. But emotional tilt is we can flip-flop between being angry and sad. One way to look at it is that you can get hostile, right? You might feel everyone's out to get you and attack you. Or the flip side is you might feel fragile, right? Fragile and unsafe. And the last one is just lost and stuck. And what's interesting about the C state is that when someone is in that window, these 5 tend to show up. But I hate to tell you, we will all be in that window at some point or another. We have all been in that window. And so the key isn't to sort of determine like the character of like you're either those 5 things or not. It's recognizing it happens to all of us. And I think of sports as almost like playing defense and offense. We all need to learn how to play defense. And the more skilled we get, the more muscle we'll build. We can actually traverse through this process faster. And that's the key. It's not to be able to avoid it, because the more have you ever avoided these things, right? Which is, there are usually imbalances in people. There are people who are, just dive into the problems, even to the point of recklessness, and those who deny it and avoid it. But there's different types. We call them arrogant versus insecure. So some people hate that language, especially the arrogant ones, right? So whoever feels insecure, raise your hand, right? Whoever's not, you know who you are, right? We're arrogant. We're overly confident. We don't have as much humility. Versus you can be overly humble, not enough confidence. And that's what leads to arrogant deciders, decision makers tend to make arrogant calls at the point of stress. Insecure do the opposite. They make insecure calls. But the reason why this list is important is this. One of the interesting things we found was that decision making, which is the unique aspect of human beings, making the right judgment call. And the challenge, by the way, I'll walk you through is not once, but you're gonna have to do it repeatedly, usually 7 right calls in a row to get a touchdown or to a certain level of success you can bank. Decisions follow our emotions. Now, I know some of you here, you're very good. I'm sure you are at doing data-driven decision-making. I put my emotions aside, right? And, I'm just that talented at just shoving that part of myself out, just compartmentalize, and I make a dispassionate, unbiased decision. And you might even think that this side of you never comes out, right? If you haven't driven around, if you haven't tried anything difficult, yeah, this might never show up. But if you pick up anything challenging, these things will show up. When you pick up something challenging where other people can see it, meaning the notion of exposing versus hiding, they'll show up even more because human beings, we tend to be, we always grade on a scale, we're always comparing. Yeah, they tell you stay in your own lane. Like, that's what we're supposed to do. You can't stay in your own lane. We can run so many tests and we run interviews, and literally when you have teams competing, you just have to throw out a laughter. It doesn't matter who it's from. Everyone's going to think one team is having fun and we're not. It's amazing how difficult it is to stay in your own lane. It's just almost impossible. And so you can train yourself to actually go through these states and get out faster. But decisions follow our emotions. You'll see this happening when, we say like the most important decisions you make when you joined the military, say, to risk your life, that might not have been the most logical choice at times, right? The advice you got from friends and family and people might not have been to go do that. When you usually decide to get married to someone, sometimes it's not the most logical choice. And if you've had friends or parents come up with a logical list of the reasons why this will not work out, and you look at it, you agree with it, throw it out, you just go make what you say with your gut or your heart. That's an emotional choice. We do this all the time. And you'll find the most important things, we tend to make emotional decisions. And so the notion of not fighting it, but understanding how to process our emotions is the key, which is why you'll see an app we built that you'll try out called OMM, On My Mind, is really tied to helping you become more aware of your own emotions. The feedback and getting feedback from a colleague, which is the hardest thing to do. Hearing what your colleagues think, what your community thinks of you, not your boss. The boss is supposed to be tough on you, is supposed to be critical on you, but what the people I'm with think, that is hard. And Greg and Tom are going to cover more of this as we go through, but I'm trying to think. So this is part of the setup of understanding where the biggest issue comes. And if you think about this, one of the interesting things about outcome bias, as the coach, as the leader, the person in charge, when you have someone in an A position performing at C levels, right? What we tend to do is we have outcome bias as a coach, right? That job needs to get done. So are we going to focus on getting them better and set the right way, or are we going to focus on outcome? We focus on outcome. But here's what we found that was even more perverse. That individual is 2 times more outcome biased than the coach. You think they want to fail? You think they don't know? They are twice as high in their outcome bias. They're looking to latch onto anything that might give them score, that might give them results. And so usually this is the worst state to be in terms of getting advice, right? And you'll find this, they take advice from strangers on the subway or on the bus. I mean, it's like crazy where like they'll make these crazy decisions and latch on to advice that comes from anywhere. They're dying to succeed even more than the coach. And so going into this, what we found was this. So like kind of, if you understand and appreciate what the situation is, the number one thing to first think about is not how to help them get better, but it's actually to stop doing more wrong. We as a coach, as a leader, we go in with the intention to help them. And we end up doing, there's 2 things we do that end up doing more damage. So this is the dial down the wrong. We do more wrong, although we intend to help. And in the process of doing more wrong, this thing spirals to get worse and worse, right? So when you, and You're going to say something?
I'm not going to show the whole thing.
You know, sorry, I'm like totally running out of whiteboard space, but
you know,
I'll show you this interesting thing. There's a lot of interesting data we get just from across different industries. And one of the more interesting ones was understanding kind of this notion of once someone becomes a C player, what happens? And we have a board member who built a fascinating hedge fund, and he built it by collecting over 20 years of data on every stock analyst in the world. So every recommendation they've made for 20 years and how those recommendations performed, right? It's kind of an interesting set of data. And you track this performance, and what he found was this. You apply an 80-20 rule, 80% of the analysts, literally you will lose money following their recommendations. It's better to just go with the average S&P. Just average index fund is going to do far better than 80% of the analyst recommendations. But you apply the 80-20 rule twice, and what he found was roughly 16%, you're going to pretty much break even. So you won't lose money, but that's not very good. You're investing to make money. It was only the top 4% who's really going to help you make money. It's kind of depressing, right? But and what he found was this. They were right 62% of the time. So being right is that difficult, which is why even coaching someone out of a C state is so difficult. We're going to first talk about how to prevent doing more wrong, but 62%. So then they looked at the bottom 4%. And this was even more interesting. They were wrong 74% of the time. In fact, they made more money going with the exact opposite of their recommendation. When you think about the idea that, information and decision-making, I mean, this is as bright as they come. Right? You're talking about the smartest people who go to the best schools, looking at more information than you can imagine across everything, globally, company-wise, people, everything, to then make a decision on where to spend your money, to buy or sell something. And so 74% wrong, 62% right. And this is where the reason why this is important is when someone is in this job that's important, and is performing in a C state, this is the damage that shows up. And when the damage shows up, we go into this circular thing. I'm sure we've all experienced at some point. I don't know if you ever want to shake them, right? You're angry, obviously. How the hell could you do this? Like, I mean, literally, you look at it and you're like, oh my God, how could you do this? So then you go into this state where you're like, that's a waste of my energy, so I will ignore them, right? So then you end up ignoring them. But this uniquely human thing creeps in, which is guilt, right? And I start to feel guilty because I should be coaching them. I'm a better leader. I should be able to help them. So you go and coddle them, and that shows up in different ways, which I'll show you in a sec. And then what happens? They go and drive again, and then you want to shake them. And you just repeat this loop, right? And maybe some of you haven't fully experienced this, but this is crazy how fast this cycle can go. And so
and just to be clear, we're talking about the AC. This is important because the job is that important. They're responsible to drive results. They're in a position of power and they're not getting the job done. That's the frustrating part as a human, right? As a coach, you need to get the results. And what I find I want to say sometimes is hurry up and process your stuff because you got to get this done, which sounds awful, right? But that's actually what's happening. Hurry up because you need to get results done because you're in that position. Not the case for somebody who doesn't have such a high responsibility, but it's those few people where you feel so frustrated. It's the frustration, but then quickly goes into, I feel bad, right? So I go from really angry to really just frustrated. I'll just ignore them and let them figure it out to then coddling. That's the vicious cycle. We're saying from our own experience. I think if you have a position or have people under you who have that, that's what I think is happening all the time. It's this vicious cycle. I'm angry, I'm sad, I feel guilty. Repeat. I'm angry, I'm sad, I feel guilty. Repeat. And this vicious loop.
So one of the first things we do wrong is we are trying to continuously get them to drive. We need and remember, it's not an on and off switch, which is the difference in machines and people. You need to dial down the amount they're driving, especially where there's A jobs and A things, and we need to dial up their self-awareness. So I'll explain to you a different way. There are 3 levels of awareness. So it starts with self. Then it goes to team. You have to understand, right? The other players on the situational awareness. You have to understand what's happening. And then when you do all that, you're driving. You drive. Decision making. If I had to draw a diagram, think of this as like being in a car, right? And you have team and whatnot. And then think of this as looking at the roads, the trees, right? Like all the obstacles and driving, right? I mean, very simple analogy. If the person is drunk, you don't want them driving, right? And when they're drunk, the thing you have to do is sober them up. And there's a certain degree, and I think we'll talk more in detail about what we mean by sobering up. But you think of what is happening here in 2 parts. There's part 1 and part 2. We are so outcome obsessed on part 2, the need to get the job done. We're not taking the time to do part 1 right. And when I think of what we tend to do, and this is kind of a very subtle way that we make a mistake, we show them a piece of the map. Imagine taking someone who's drunk and telling you that I'm fine, I'm going to be fine, right? And you know they're drunk, but you're telling them there's a really important meeting that's happening an hour away in Long Island, and it starts in like 30 minutes. Them hearing that, they will jump in and they will floor the gas and drive. We end up actually bringing them into the situation more times than not, where it's fascinating what tends to happen when someone is in this state. There are 2 things we tend to do. It's what I call the hidden demotion. So the hidden demotion looks like this. One is we calm them out, so they're out of the loop on communications, right? Because once again, if they aren't situationally aware, they tend not to drive. They might be sitting in their car, but they're going to drive the minute you calm them in, so we tend to calm them out. They're out of certain email groups, out of certain meetings. And you tend to leave them in the dark so that they don't accidentally start driving. And the minute you coddle and calm them in, you'll see them drive again, right? The other thing we tend to do is we tend to dial down their responsibilities. Now, it's interesting how this occurs. There's many ways this occurs. Oftentimes, we end up bifurcating the positions. In most companies, years ago, there was only one person in charge of technology. But if that person's strong, companies will still have one head of technology. But now there's a CTO, a CIO, maybe a head of engineering, head of cybersecurity. There used to be one head of HR. Now there's a head of HR. There's a head of talent, as if the HR head doesn't do talent. There's a head of learning, which once again, the HR head doesn't do learning. Like, it's amazing how you start to find passive aggressive ways to manage these situations. You start to dial down responsibility from one individual. You start to create separate units. And so this is something we do. And what's interesting is, although this sounds awful, I would argue this is still the right thing to do. But the problem is this: we are doing this, and then because of guilt, we stop doing it, and then the whole cycle keeps going. And what ends up happening is, because we know part 2 is so important, we need something else to latch onto. And this is the part of actually needing to help them get sober. And so we'll spend a little bit more time. But the second thing in this process, so I don't know if this makes sense. We're going to ask questions and all this. But the second one is separating intrusive versus compassionate leadership. We got this spending time with the Navy SEALs and liked it a lot, which is intrusive but compassionate leadership. Right? You need to be intrusive, especially when you're running something that has an A job aspect. You can't afford to run it like an intramural sport, right? Thanks for trying. You did your best. It's not good enough. Like, there's a real cost for the enterprise failing. So as a result of it, you have to be intrusive, but you have to find a way to show compassion. But the biggest mistake that occurs is the truth is oftentimes intrusive. The idea of feedback. And then compassion is where the coaching comes in essence, helping you process what's happening. The problem is it's the same person doing both. You're the only one giving the truth, right? You're the only one giving the truth, and then it's like the very next minute you're trying to coach them on that. I'm sure we've all done this, right? I want to tell you how much wrong you're doing, and all this stuff. Now I'm going to help you process what I just told you, right? I'm going to try to help you work through it, and the person isn't listening. They just feel like they're terrorized, they're under attack. And so you're coming in with this intention to be helpful, but you end up leaving feeling like an asshole. And I know most of us have been in this position. And so what we have found was you need to find a way to get the feedback to come from others so that you can then help them process it. And when you have the same person giving the truth and the only one giving the truth, which tends to happen, especially when it tends to be people in these roles, you find the whole thing just falls apart. So the only lever we tend to use is volume, right? So like we just go louder, we're more threatening. And then we're trying to coach them to help them. And we're wondering why it's not working. So you need to find a way to separate this. So I don't know if any questions so far in any of this.
We could open up questions, but we could also take a quick bio break. Do you want to do a question?
Question?
Yeah, go ahead.
We just had, Chris and I had a speech that was given by Dr. Liz Cavallero from the Naval War College. And I think that bottom point is fascinating because one of her premises for peer coaching, because that's kind of her focus point, is that if you reflect, like self-reflect on your life, in order to achieve, promote, and foster personal growth for yourself and others, you need that combination, that balance of challenge and support. And so I just find this fascinating because you're right, that feedback from others, sometimes, that provides the challenge kind of from a safe standpoint. And then you've got those trained coaches, who are there to offer the support to promote that growth.
No, that's exactly it. And then I think we were going to share kind of where feedback can go wrong, where it doesn't feel safe, and where people will then fight it even more, which has a lot to do with.
But can I tell you the challenge that model would have? How many trained coaches can you hire for how many people? And I think that, at the very, very top, and this is the challenge most organizations have faced. How do you do this in scale? How do you do it so it's not just for less than 2% of my people?
But the premise is right? That feedback is not coming directly from or only from the coach, we should say. It's not that the coach can't give any feedback. It's that they're not hearing it when that same coach is then trying to help them process it. Because you're either going to feel angry that the coach is giving you the feedback. It's your job to tell me this. You're either my boss or you're somebody senior, so you're supposed to tell me I suck. Or you get really sad, right? You feel you've disappointed that leader, disappointed that coach. So I find they either feel really angry and hostile about it, or they feel really sad to the point of I'm disappointing you and I can never do anything right and I feel awful about it. But you're right in that's the model we're trying to create. It's just not the trained. Right. Why you're reacting is the notion of a trained coach. We're trying to train everybody to learn how to do this.
Right. So what we're trying to do, by the way, in this opening talk is kind of walk you through what's happening, in fact, how it goes wrong for one individual. What Tom and Greg will cover is the notion of how to do it in scale. Which is really tied to how to set up and train your community to come to the aid. We believe in outside coaches. We get some of the best in the world interfacing with us. It's just that it's never going to be able to cover the community, the whole organization. And so you have to, this is what people call culture. It's what people call like everyone needs to be both a student and a teacher to kind of set up that community. So, and if you think of what Harvard did in their study for DDOs, they basically studied saying this notion of development, can it happen in scale, out of the classroom, not just on a jumpstart basis of Leadership Academy for 3 days or a lecture, but happening on an everyday basis, weekly rhythm. And That's what they call DDOs. A company who's figured out how to do it in scale. And that's what, hopefully over the course of the 3 days, we will share everything we've learned. And I don't want you to take away that we figure this out. We are far from done. In fact, we have challenges in the same realm over and over again. And so this is a very challenging topic. I think in hindsight, machines are a hell of a lot easier than people. We always say if you could open someone's heads, everyone's heads, and see what's really going on, God, it's so much easier to go figure out what's going on. Like kind of like a Jean Grey, X-Men type, read their minds, like Professor Xavier. I mean, think about trying to operate in a machine, make a machine better when something's not working without opening up the hood, only doing it from the outside, which, by the way, is exactly hiding the problems is. When it comes to people, when you don't open it up and don't get to see what's happening, it's like trying to fix the machine without opening up the hood. Question?
I was with you. I'm actually still struggling with dial down driving. Part one and part two. Can you just slow down this a little bit?
Sure.
Back over that, because I feel like that's fundamental. If I don't get it, it's hard to keep up.
I think the simplest analogy I use is the driver and the driving notion, right? Remember, there are people in the car, right? And especially if you have an important role. When you make decisions, this data point will come true, which is close to the majority, the supermajority, 74% of what they decide, every call they make, will be the wrong call, which means it hurts the enterprise, it hurts the team. And so getting someone who is drunk to go and, drive, it has its high cost. So the key then is, how do we sober them up faster? Is maybe the question.
Why just give it this walk through steps? So self-awareness and then what's
Team awareness. Self-awareness, team awareness, situational awareness. There's 3 forms of awareness before you drive, right? You have to be, aware of yourself. You have to be aware of the team members you have. And you have to be aware of the situation out in front of you. And it gets harder and harder as you move away from self, although self is probably one of the hardest. But I mean, situationally, it's much more complicated. And so one way to look at it, and I'll talk about kind of strategies of how we actually coach and help the AAs. One of the top things that we call alertness. You have to be super alert, but you need to be alert of yourself, your team, your situation, which is same as awareness. And when someone isn't alert about themselves, the rest of it tends not to happen.
One obvious option, although maybe it's not so easy in most of our organizations, is that potentially that A job, C person, what if you give the opportunity for the C person to go down to a B job or C job, where all of a sudden they can succeed and maybe get some foundational things? Because sometimes it seems like your whole point is we're spending a lot of time on these particular people. And some people might actually find that to be a relief.
So I look at it as, most of us who have been in these positions, if you're fortunate enough for someone to volunteer to step down from that A role to a B role, if you're fortunate enough that they might retire sooner or quit, and I say fortunate.
It can feel like a demotion. This is the thing we struggle with all the time, because we don't have a fire policy. We don't fire. We have a no fire policy. So then people will sometimes say, God, would it just be easier if I just got fired versus demoted? God, would you rather be fired than demoted? But the shame that comes with that. But this is exactly what we're going to talk about, which is to give them a C job, not demote them out of the role. They're still in the role, but have them practice
a training
learning
job
about who they are here, learning about this, and something that's easier. It's easier to see yourself in something that's not core to your. Anytime you attack sort of, I'm in charge of this, I'm really not. If I'm unself-aware, I'm scared, I'm desperate, I feel emotional tilt, I'm in my head. It's when people are in their head. This whole thing could just be described as being in your head. So they're not really hearing you. This is, I'm protecting, this is my job. But if you put me on something else and you bump up the stress there so you can see who they are even faster, they can say, oh my God, I am like that. And I'm like that in my main role, my A job. But that's exactly what we're going to talk about.
So let me just add this one piece that might help alleviate some of the questions. When you think of most things, it's awareness and action. You get aware, and then you go and act, right? Even the OODA loop is all built this way. But what tends to occur in most of these cases is you have to flip it oftentimes, especially when someone's in a C state. Talking to someone about being stuck in their head doesn't get you anywhere. And this is what we tend to do, right? We try to, through volume and different creative variations, just to talk to them to see that you're kind of hurting us, yourself, everything's bad. And how many times do they nod and get it? I get it. And then they come back and nothing's changed. And when you're talking about the demotion to the B role, this is what dial down responsibility is. The way we do it, because they're not offering, is we create 2 roles of Bs that equate to 1 role of A. And then now you're creating 4 roles of Cs to create, it's like, this is a spiral that we get into. So oftentimes we need action to help them become aware. So the way we looked at this was this. When someone is a victim, 49% of their world feels like it is in their control. So in their control, or maybe in my control. And when you ask them what's going wrong, they're pointing outwards. And the goal, by the way, is to just help them make a 2% jump. And that 2%, by the way, is so hard. It's so much emotional toil that it sounds easy, 2%. So they become empowered. And when you become empowered, you're now 51% of everything is in my control. And why this number is important, and this is where you start to point most energy, most things inwardly. This is important because once something is majority, we tend to attack the majority. How many times, we got this great phrase from this team at the Air Force called PACE. They had this simple formula. They said, perception drives mindset, and then behaviors follow. So oftentimes the perception we have is, it's impossible. So when something you believe is impossible, our mindset is, why bother? And then have you ever seen the behaviors of someone who has that mindset? It never improves. It's impossible, right? When you're in a victim state, it's the Air Force that's the problem. It's my, you have issue after issue, and not that they aren't true. It's that you believe 51% of most things are out of my control. I only 49%, so why bother? Even if I did everything perfectly, I won't even get majority. Versus when you get empowered, there are 2 things that happen. You say, despite the constraints, what are my options and choices? Despite the constraints, what are my options and choices? And this is what you want to help someone get to. And so the way you do it, this awareness in action, is this. If you tend to have an A job, data point number 1. If you can find a way, and once again, you don't have to use the feedback app, but if you can find a way for them to get feedback on that A job, that's data point number 1. But it's never enough. We're pattern recognizers. So you need to help them create data point number 2. Now, sometimes you might need data point number 3, 4, and so forth. And data point number 2 is to take a C job. And one of the, sorry, you can't see down here, but kind of run out of whiteboard. You have to test as the coach your outcome bias. Meaning, the job still needs to be important enough, but you should focus on being able to coach them versus it's important to get the job done. If you find yourself giving them some task where getting the job done, right, is more important, meaning you are unable to underwrite and risk the job getting done poorly, but for the purpose of helping them see what's happening. Data point number 2, you need then feedback from colleagues on this, and then you hope to coach them. Now, there are 2 things that we found of why we ended up building the feedback app the way he did. One was people who are in especially A jobs in C states, people struggle to give them feedback, especially to their face, because they tend to either be hostile or fragile, or both. The other part is this: when they're in this state, they attack the giver. Attack the giver. They spend more time discrediting the giver than accepting the feedback. And one of the most maddening things that we had to develop, and we did all of this manually before we built it into an app, was that if you look at what's happening with the feedback, we set it up so you can't see who said this. Like, you want to blame someone for this terrible feedback. You know it's in your community. It's in this room. But I can't tell who it is. And the most maddening thing is to get them to start to only look at themselves. And the biggest key in the feedback is not what one piece of feedback says, but it's the pattern when it starts to connect. When 6, 7 different people, 8 different people say the exact same thing, it has to make you pause and say, is that true? But it's crazy for someone, if you knew who they were, you could find a way to discredit every single one of them.